Today on the channel, we're talking about evolution and whether evolution can provide evidence for design. It's probably not going to be the stream that you're expecting it's going to be. I've got a philosopher, theologian. Well, he's a theologian and philosopher of religion. His name, I've tried to, we talked before this. I'm going to try to pronounce it correctly. Dr. Rope. Is that correct? Did I get it?
No, but
okay.
It's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, and then I've got an evolutionary biologist with us as well, Dr. Zachary Ardern, who is actually one of our advisors for Capturing Christianity. So it's great to have both of you here. Zach, is this your first time on the channel? I don't think so.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's the first official.
First official on the channel. That's awesome. Yeah, and for sure this is Dr. Rope's first time on the show as well. So really looking forward to today. We've got a really long, I say long, but it's a presentation that both of these guys have put together as a sort of joint project to put forward some of the ideas that they have today to share with you. And this is cutting edge stuff in science and in philosophy. So this is going to be really, really cool. Again, probably not what you're expecting. And so I'm just really looking forward to getting into it. I don't want to waste a whole lot of time either. So let's just jump right into it. How would you guys, actually first let's do this. So because it's both of these guys' first time on the channel, I'm going to give them some time to talk about a little bit who they are and what they do. And it's just so you can get some familiarity with their work. And so why don't we start with Dr. Ardern, and then we'll move on to Rope. So Ardern, take it away.
Yeah, I have a slide on my research to start with, maybe useful if we flick to that. I'm an evolutionary geneticist. I think pretty early.
Is it that one?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so these are some of the things that I've been working on, a range of different things across microbial evolution. So recently I've been looking at both bacteria and viruses, and I guess I'm interested in fundamental evolutionary theory. So how does evolution actually work at the molecular level? So yeah, a range of things on that topic. What are genes? How do they evolve? What about, can genes overlap each other? How does the genetic code fit with that? And I did both philosophy and biology in my undergrad. So I'm interested in the theoretical side of evolutionary biology.
Excellent. Is there another slide here, or is that it?
That's it. Yep.
Okay, great. All right. Well, why don't we turn it over to Dr. Rope? And I'll just keep this slide up for you as well. Actually, let me go ahead and pull you full screen so people can see you.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. It's great to be here with you. And it's great that we're both here with Zachary, because I think this is a topic that's a bit complex. Like, we need scientific expertise, but then there's also a lot of theology and philosophy that goes into it.
Right. So tell the audience just a little bit. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I've been interested in this topic of design arguments basically for my entire researcher career. I mean, I've done other stuff also in religion and science, but here's some papers that specifically address the issue of design. So I started with the book, The Intelligent Design Debate and the Temptation of Scientism. So basically, it's a sympathetic overview of the debate over intelligent design, just trying to understand all the views. But while I was doing that, I started thinking that the whole opposition between biological design arguments and evolution might be misguided, as commonly accepted as it is. So then I wrote this other book. And these are really expensive academic books, so I'm not expecting anyone to buy them, but I try to make stuff also freely available as possible.
That's great. Well, I appreciate both of you guys coming on to discuss this. Should we just jump right into the material, or how do you want to begin?
Yeah, let's jump in.
Okay. I'll just pull the slides back up. So we're going to be going back and forth between slides and a lot of. We're also going to try to keep it pretty conversational. So before we begin, let me just go ahead and let you know, if you're interested in these kinds of subjects, evolution, Christianity, apologetics, philosophy, theology, any of these topics, you might consider subscribing to this channel, turning on the little bell so you can get notified when we post new videos like this. So, all right, let's get started. Here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and forward the slides a little bit to to this one, which I think is the next one. So whoever would like to take this one.
Yeah, so I guess we both have a lot to say about this. I mean, Zachary, as a biologist, obviously is really familiar with how biologists talk about design all the time. But really, it goes back to the beginning of written history pretty much, and the ancient Greek philosophers, maybe even before that. It just seems that the appearance of design strikes us, maybe even intuitively, when we look at nature. Like it's acknowledged by both critics of design arguments usually, and also and obviously by the proponents. So here we have a couple of quotes from Richard Dawkins and William Paley, and then overlapping we have the picture from this year, just a model of the cellular landscape. You see the mitochondria, you see the DNA and its transcription, and it just seems like this stuff is not like random. It's doing stuff, moving towards a purpose, it has certain functions. It's not random. So this, for many people, gives the kind of appearance of design.
Yeah, and Richard Dawkins is interesting
because
he's. Richard Dawkins is interesting because he's just so clear on this, that things really do look like they're designed. And for him, of course, the answer to all this is natural selection. But he recognizes that the early design proponents like William Paley were really getting something right about design, that things really are remarkably adapted for their environment, for instance. And he follows very much in the line of Darwin, and emphasizing that natural selection is the answer to that. But we're going to be, I guess, asking the deeper question of what lies behind natural selection. So over the next little while, we'll try and unpack why natural selection might not be the full answer that a lot of people think it is regarding the question of design and biology.
One of the questions that pops up in my mind immediately is it really natural selection that's like doing all of the work? Because from what I understand about evolution, it's not just natural selection, it's also random mutation. So how does that sort of fit in here, or is that going to come later?
Yeah, I can quickly comment on that the way that people like Dawkins see it is it's natural selection that does the designing work. So random mutation is because it's random, it's not doing anything interesting. It's providing you a change, but it's not giving any directionality to that change. And so anything that looks particularly well constructed, adapted, particularly fit, particularly suited for an environment, that work will be done by natural selection in the views of an adaptationist like Richard Dawkins. There are some others in evolutionary biology who think there are other forces which are also important. And maybe we will get onto that a little bit, maybe more in a future session where we focus on the science a bit more. But okay. For now, I think just important to realize that for Darwin, and particularly for Dawkins, it's natural selection which is doing the work of why things really look so well adapted for their environment.
Fair enough. Do you have anything to say?
So when Dawkins comments on Paley's design argument, William Paley was writing around the year 1802. His natural theology book. So he argued that if you find where to find a kind of watch on a heath, then its organized complexity would make you prefer an explanation in terms of design rather than chance. So Dawkins agrees with that. Like he agrees that chance processes alone are a really poor explanation for life, and he's at pains to emphasize that evolution is not just a chance process. That it's more than just the random mutations. It's the natural selection working on those and shifting from the huge number of random mutations, and then natural selection works as this kind of blind watchmaker that can in fact construct all of this according to Dawkins without design. And so in that way it would undercut Paley's design argument.
All right, I think it's a good time to cut back to the slides. So I'll go ahead and pull those back up and go ahead and progress here.
Yeah, so one thing we wanted to emphasize is that the design argument actually is quite old. Like it definitely is a lot older than Paley. It's a lot older than the modern intelligent design movement, for example. It's older than evolutionary biology. So we could look at a lot of different examples, but I guess probably the earliest written example of this comes from Socrates. And this is actually David Sedley in his book Creationism and Its Critics in Antiquity. He says that this probably does go back to the historical Socrates. Yes, Socrates probably did exist as well. So Socrates says in Xenophon's Memorabilia, which was written around 371 BC, Socrates asks us, compare things with regard to which there is no sign of what they are for, and then things which evidently serve a beneficial purpose. So which ones do you judge to be the products of chance and which of design? Now, Socrates has a lot more to say about this as well, but if we were to condense this into a few main premises, then it would be like premise one, like products of chance typically don't do not serve some kind of manifest purpose, whereas products of design typically do so. The living beings, particularly humans, are so structured that their every feature serves some kind of purpose. Like noses are needed to breathe and to smell, mouths are needed to talk and eat, and eyes are needed to see, and so on. Then it seems to Socrates that which originally produced living beings, including humans, did so by design and not by chance. So this is kind of an argument from analogy and induction, like based on our experience of what kind of stuff chance processes produce and what kind of stuff design produces.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting that it goes back so far, and there's this simple dichotomy between chance and design, and you actually see the same things cropping up again and again throughout the next 2 millennia or so when people are discussing design arguments that I think it's plausible. Actually, the main alternative to design, when you really push it back, is something like chance. For instance, you see this in the case of the multiverse proposal as an alternative to fine tuning. You kind of an appeal to large possibilities combined with chance. So yeah, this is something that we'll talk through a little bit more over the next little while.
All right, I'll go ahead and advance here.
I guess, yeah. Thanks. So there's quite a lot of these design arguments that we could go through, like early Jewish design arguments from Philo of Alexandria and such. We could go through Hindu design arguments, medieval teleological arguments, and so on, which all have the distinctive features and are not necessarily the same. But anyway, there's a continuity there. So if we look at then the contemporary discussion, we also see that design arguments aren't necessarily limited to intelligent design. Like a lot of people are familiar with ID. Here we got a few books representing ID's position. The main ID proponents like Michael Behe and William Dembski used to emphasize the distinction between the designer and God. Like just because you see evidence of design in nature, that doesn't mean the designer has to be God. But maybe in recent years, we've seen more attempts at connecting the two. Like Meyer's recent return of the God hypothesis, arguing that the scientific design argument actually points to God and not just to a limited designer. Then if we look at theistic evolutionists, so this means those Christians who think evolution and belief in creation are compatible. Then you also have some people defending like a fine-tuning argument for design. But then there's other people who say that actually the whole category of design it doesn't really fit with God. Like Connor Cunningham, for example, in this book says that it seems perfectly fair to say that if ID had gotten what it thinks it wants, that is an inference to a designer, then it would amount to one of the most significant arguments for atheism ever. For the designer now proved would not be worthy of worship. So Cunningham says that if Dawkins really wanted to oppose belief in God, he should rather be a proponent of intelligent design rather than evolution. So the idea here is that God is not like some super engineer, and if we limit God to that, then we're actually not advancing the case for Christianity or theism. So we have quite a wide range of attitudes among theistic evolutionists to the idea of design arguments. Zachary, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think just really helpful to see that there is this spectrum, and there's really not a simple dichotomy between, for instance, intelligent design and theistic evolution. There's a whole range of different subtle philosophical positions on what do we mean by design. Do we even want to make design arguments? Would that actually be helpful for theology or actually unhelpful for theology? So there's a lot of kind of philosophical and philosophical theological points that kind of need to be straightened out when we're talking about the design argument. And a lot of people would just assume, oh, if you talk about design, that means you're talking about intelligent design. And that's not necessarily true. That intelligent design has a fairly specific meaning regarding biology, regarding the denial of Darwinian evolution, for instance. So we want to unpack something that we think is kind of a middle position between classic design arguments and theistic evolution.
Yeah, that's going to be super interesting. I'm really excited to see where you guys go with this. All right, I'm going to go ahead and advance.
Yeah, so this the whole controversial nature of the design argument, and the totally opposite attitudes that people have, was one of the first things that drew me into this discussion. Like, really, you have some people saying that, well, here's your scientific proof of God, like Meyer, and then you have others like Dawkins saying that no, actually the scientific picture of evolution shows that there's probably no designer. Well, this slide is still just our introductory materials, so this is just to show that we realize that there's actually quite a lot of history here. Like we have philosophical critiques of design arguments, such as the ones presented by David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, who has a really nice book called The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, where he has like a fairly thorough, like, both defense and a critique of design arguments as they were understood at that time. So a lot of people take the line that Hume already showed the design arguments to be bad, but in their time, actually, even Paley's work comes only after Hume, and it was really popular.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a bit of confusion on this topic amongst within the writings of someone like Richard Dawkins. So a lot of new atheists would be big fans of Hume and would think that he's destroyed the design argument, but also people put a huge amount of emphasis on Darwin doing the real work. So there's kind of an inconsistency and a tension there. Who was it who killed the design argument finally? Was it already dead because of Hume, or did it require Darwin to do it? And yeah, I think that's interesting. And I guess we'll be focusing on the idea that Darwin killed the design argument, and showing that that's actually not necessarily the case, that we can take Darwin for what he said as legitimate and still have a design argument remaining. Yeah.
So I'm curious, what is Barth's role in this? Because I'm obviously familiar with Hume and Darwin, but Barth I'm not so familiar with. So what was his critique? What was his design argument critique?
Well, Barth here is just one representative of 20th century theology. Like, he's an enormously influential theologian who thought that all attempts, basically your entire channel is an attempt at idolatry. Whenever you try to present some kind of evidence for design, because because Barth basically thought that the whole idea of natural theology, the idea of that reason could find some kind of evidence of God and then construct some idea of God, thereby would inevitably lead to a corruption of Christianity.
So he really
this was,
emphasized,
of course, a reaction against the Nazism of his time as well.
Yeah, so he really emphasized the need for divine revelation in order to know, I guess, anything about God, as I understand. That's his real focus. So he was very suspicious of any attempt to kind of reason upwards. And this has historical, like philosophical precedent, I guess, in some earlier German philosophers, I guess. There's all kinds of influences which are skeptical of our ability to say anything about God, given God's kind of difference to us.
All right, that's sufficient for me. Why don't we go ahead and progress here?
Yeah, so I guess one additional thing that we could say, this is all still part of our background material, but I hope you guys still find it interesting, because we will also apply some of this stuff later. We're just trying to give you some basic background on the design argument and why it might even be interesting, and basically how evolution might impact it. So a lot of people think that because even the fact that the design arguments still persist, even despite all of this critique, is that they are somehow like natural to human cognition, like they're really intuitive. Like we have these intuitive modes of agent detection that for some reason just trigger in the case of nature. And the idea is that maybe this kind of experience of design in nature, or perception of design, might actually precede all these design arguments. So Hume, as a critic of this design argument, it's really interesting that he also seems to have felt the force of this experience, like writing in the dialogues concerning natural religion, that a purpose, an intention, or a design strikes everywhere the most careless, the most stupid thinker, and no man can be so hardened in absurd systems as at all times to reject it. It's hard to know, like, if the characters in the dialogues represent Hume's view completely. Like, this is the skeptical character, this Philo, who says this. But at least we can tell that he felt the force of the experience, or knew somehow.
Yeah, so this whole area is, I guess, the cognitive psychology of religion, and I guess that's a whole other topic that could be explored, but is feeding into, or some of the literature on this is feeding into why we might have the design intuitions that we do. So that this is also another area of philosophical debate. Is this going to undermine the legitimacy of our design intuitions or not? But I guess quickly I'd say it won't undermine it if we're able to offer some kind of design argument. If we just had design intuitions, then there might be a problem. But the point of design argument is to build on these intuitions and show that they're warranted in some other way.
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean,
I
just
personally think. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'll come in after you.
Yeah, I'm also, like, I know some of this literature on the cognitive science of religion, and people in that field really have like different opinions on what the implications are for the rationality of religious belief. I know you've had Justin Barrett on this channel as well, and he basically thinks that like he's the originator of the idea of hyperactive agency detection, but he basically thinks, as far as I understand, that it would mostly produce false positives, like in the case of danger, and mostly it would have to be reliable. So I really think that you need like arguments outside of the cognitive science of religion to threaten even the intuitive reliability.
Yeah, I was going to say something along the same lines. So you took the words right out of my mouth with Justin Barrett. Okay, let's return now to the slides. I'll go ahead and progress here. Incompatibility of design and evolution is commonly assumed by critics of evolutionary theory.
Yeah, so creationists, intelligent design proponents will generally not really argue for this so much, as they'll just kind of assume it, that they'll agree with Dawkins, I guess, that once you have an evolutionary explanation, there's no point appealing to design explanation. It would be redundant. Maybe Roper can explain a bit more these quotes.
Yeah, so young Earth creationist John Woodmorappe has this nice essay, The Horse and the Tractor, that's been published in the Answers magazine, I think, and also on the young Earth creationist website. So the basic idea is that he presents this analogy of the horse and the tractor. To explain how the farmer does his work, you could say that the farmer could put like a horse drawing the tractor, but this wouldn't really add anything to the power of the tractor. Like the tractor is already sufficient enough, and so Woodmorappe says that adding theism, like adding God to evolution, is unnecessary because evolution already explains life if it works, and also if you believe that God created life, you also don't need like evolution because God already explains it. So it's like useless to have two explanations. And the same basic idea is also expressed by Dembski, the great intelligent design proponent, who argues that by Occam's razor, since God is an unnecessary rider in our understanding of the natural world, according to evolutionary biology, as interpreted by Dembski, then theistic evolution ought to dispense with all talk of God outright and get rid of the useless adjective theistic. So Dembski is not saying that we should get rid of God. Like he's just saying that this would be the most logical interpretation of evolutionary biology, and also he thinks that this is the mainstream interpretation of evolution. Like the simplicity of explanations should lead us to eliminate God if evolution is true.
Yeah, so the point of our argument is to show a way around this kind of common assumption.
All right, I'll go ahead and...
This really depends, I'll just say one more thing. This depends on your account of explanation. Like, when do you have a situation in which two explanations can work together, and when does one explanation make another unnecessary? So this is really like a philosophical issue, and people don't treat it as such. Like, people just assume that simplicity alone determines this, but it actually doesn't. Like, there's a lot of other things to consider. Like, maybe God could bring some more explanatory power, like as a philosophical explanation, even if you don't need God on the scientific level.
All right, I'll go ahead and advance here. Zach, why don't you take this one to start?
This is picking up specifically. Yeah, this is picking up specifically on the idea that because evolution is said to be unguided on the Darwinian definition, that's kind of an added problem or maybe the main problem for why God is redundant. Because if evolution is really unguided, then by definition God is not guiding it, and therefore what's God's role? Therefore God has no role. That's the kind of argument that a lot of intelligent design people present, including Philip Johnson.
Yeah, this is really central because Philip Johnson was like the early great visionary leader of the intelligent design movement. And this same kind of ideas are repeated in a lot of the writings. To be fair, you could also find a lot of popularizers of evolutionary biology saying the same thing, like that evolution is indeed undirected, that evolution does indeed refute design. So Johnson doesn't draw it like from thin air, but he just thinks that Dawkins is presenting the rhetorical situation correctly.
Yeah, so a lot of this is coming from the atheist popularizers of evolutionary biology, and their presentation of the biology has been taken as scientifically correct, basically, and also metaphysically correct by the intelligent design proponents. That if this account of evolution were true, then design would be ruled out by definition. That's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can move on. Yeah.
Here.
And so this is the counterpoint to that, which maybe Roper can continue.
Yeah, sure. So Elliot Sober is a really interesting figure because he's a major philosopher of science. Like he's not a Christian or not a theist. And he's written an article on evolution without naturalism. And he basically argues that once we look at what chance mutations actually mean in evolution and what undirectedness means in evolutionary theory, then it's discovered that it's actually like a statistical definition of chance. It's not like some kind of metaphysical claim about absolute undirectedness, absolute randomness that evolution depends on. So Sober says that the theory is consistent with there being hidden variables, like variables that direct mutations that are not accounted for in the theory. It's just that these are not explanatorily needed for the theory to proceed. And like a lot of people just say that, well, design and chance are in contradiction with each other. Later on, we're going to show some examples where they actually can work together, where we can prove that design and chance aren't like opposed necessarily. But here, maybe it's just enough to say that it depends on how we define chance. Like, is it just a measure of our ignorance of the true causes? Does it just mean like a chance meeting at the railway station, for example, an unplanned meeting like this? It means the juxtaposition of apparently unrelated causal trajectories? Or does it mean like ontological indeterminism, which you might even make the theological claim that some kind of indeterminism wouldn't even be unknown like by God, but like that would require like a theological argument.
Yeah, it seems to me like number one, epistemic ignorance is kind of like the main one that I think people, maybe the way to put it is people ought to have that one in mind when we're thinking about chance or randomness.
Yeah.
It just kind of is unknown to us.
Yeah, and basically whatever scientific account of randomness you have, it's going to be really hard to get to number three, based purely on scientific, particularly maybe biological, which is kind of a higher level science. It's dependent on other things. It's really hard to get from any biological claim down to an ontological claim about complete indeterminism and not even God knowing what the result would be. So there's just a big gap there, and the challenge for the metaphysical naturalist is who thinks that chance does rule out God is to show, okay, how are they bridging that gap? How do we know this really is a complete ontological indeterminism rather than just we don't know all the causes here? Yeah, or the causes have a particular distribution probabilistically. So this is a really strong claim. I think it's worth saying that what we're trying to say is even on pure orthodox Darwinian evolution, design is still possible, as we'll kind of unpack soon. That's a really strong claim, but it's actually an open scientific question whether this kind of evolution is actually the true form of evolution anyway. So there's a lot of debate in evolutionary theory over chance mutations and such. But we're willing to go with even the really strong form of Darwinian evolution and say that even that isn't going to undercut what we think could be a successful design argument.
All right, I think this is a good time to progress to the next slide. There you go.
Right. So one more thing maybe to add here in our introductory materials is that we're not just making a claim about the logical compatibility of evolution and design, like meaning that, well, evolution doesn't prove that there is no design. Like theistic evolutionists quite commonly just argue that we can have this broader Christian worldview, which might be supported by several kinds of evidence as well. And then within that worldview, it could be reasonable to interpret evolution as designed by the creator, even if evolutionary processes and biology itself doesn't provide us with any evidence of design. So we would have the evidence of design maybe from just like a cosmic fine-tuning, or maybe our religious faith isn't based on evidence at all. Like maybe it's some kind of basic belief. So we don't just want to make a claim about the compatibility of that. We want to address the issue of evidence of design, like as a philosophical argument from evolution. Like Michael Roos, for example, is an interesting person here because Roos, a philosopher of biology, thinks that evolution and creation are like logically compatible, but he still seems to think that evolution like changes our natural theology. Like Roos writes that in the post-Darwinian world, nature does not sing anymore of the heavens of God in the way that it used to in the age of Paley. Like in Paley's time, you just had to look in the mirror to see the clear evidence of purpose. But now with evolution, when you look at the mirror, you just see, this is the product of evolution in which we can't see design. So Roos says that after Darwin, meaning has been drained from the world and all is laid on faith. So I think we would want to say that the order of evolution and the order of biology still sings of its creator, still provides this kind of harmony that gives us evidence of design, and that this is completely compatible with evolutionary biology.
Anything else to add, Zach? I don't see your mouth open.
No,
you're about to speak.
Oh, no, I think it's good to keep going.
Okay. Oh, so this is a good time, actually. I want to pull up something. There's been a comment that came in a little bit earlier. It's a super chat. I wanted to get to it and just get your thoughts quickly on it. Is vestigiality, is that the way you say that, and junk DNA still a thing, or is it completely gone in science of human evolution? And thanks for your super chat, by the way. Looks like Tifer. So, do you have any thoughts on this, Zach?
Yeah, that's a massive question that is kind of still debated, as I understand it. So I think junk DNA is still a thing on mainstream evolutionary theory, but there's a massive ongoing debate over what proportion of the human genome is functional. So people who are debating this are like Dan Grohr on one side, who's saying very little of the human genome is functional based on his interpretation of neutral evolution. And there's a bunch of people on the other side who are saying, well, there's evidence for selection on a larger proportion of the genome than some people think. And it's not really clear how to define selection. So there's all kinds of philosophical debates around function and selection, and empirical debates over how much of the genome was subjected to natural selection in different forms. So it's really complicated, basically, and there's no clear consensus on this. But there is a bunch of stuff in the human genome that does seem to be non-functional. So it's derived from viruses, for instance, ancient viral insertions into the genome. They look, a lot of those, or like really repetitive sequences that differ between me and you and other people. So there's a lot of the genome that doesn't seem to be directly doing things, but it's a massive debate. How much is that, and what does that mean in terms of junk DNA?
So, Dr. Rope, you can come in as well if you'd like to say something, but I just, because we're in between part 1 and part 2, I just thought it was maybe a good opportunity to discuss something just a little bit related, but maybe off topic to exactly what we're...
That's cool. Like we have a lot more part divisions. Please do bring in questions. Like it's really interesting to me as well. I guess one thing that I could add is that we do have a part on the problem of bad design, and whether that has any implications for our argument. As spoilers, we think that our argument is compatible with junk DNA and bad design as well.
Okay.
It's interesting that the name. It's interesting the name there, tiefer Forschung, means deeper research. It's a German pun or something. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Okay, let's get back to the. Got the wrong thing here. Let's get back to the presentation. So here we go. Here's the next one, and we're in part 2. Sorry, I should have read that. EDA event. What is EDA?
Yeah. So we thought, what are we going to call this argument that we're trying to present? We thought, okay, let's try evolutionary design argument. So that's the EDA that we'll be trying to defend.
Okay.
So this section is trying to justify, why do we want to do this? What's the point of an EDA? So I'll try and give some thoughts on this, so then Roper can continue. One major advantage is that we're not disputing mainstream science. We're not anti-evolutionary in any sense. That means we're not challenging evolutionary biology. We're not challenging science in the classroom. We're not saying teach creation rather than evolution or anything like that. But instead, this is a philosophical interpretation of the evolutionary biology as we see it. In that way, it's analogous to the fine-tuning in physics. The question of fine-tuning in physics is not really a scientific question, though scientific premises will be relevant. But the question of should we prefer multiverse or theism, or do we even need to appeal to an explanation like that? These are largely philosophical questions. And we think there's something similar going on when you really get into the fundamental theory of evolutionary biology. That means that when we do that, we move the area of contention towards philosophy, which means that scientists can kind of relax a bit and breathe and let the philosophers explore the metaphysics, and they don't have to get too defensive about defending evolution or such. It's also interesting that this is a cosmic scale argument, that we're not talking about God tinkering with a particular molecular machine so much as the whole parameters of evolution per se. And that might be appealing theologically, that God, as the God of the cosmos, is not just interfering at very small levels, but is in charge of the whole evolutionary show. And the aim of this kind of argument will be to preserve the design intuitions that we mentioned before, which some kinds of theistic evolution will actually undermine. A lot of theistic evolutionists will accept arguments by people like Dawkins that we've got rid of the design argument now, and we can't use design arguments, or we can't trust our design intuitions. Whereas we think there are reasons we can trust the design intuitions.
Dr.
Yeah, we have a number of slides on this, so we can continue soon. But I guess one more point that I could mention here is maybe directed to those listeners who find themselves like very skeptical of evolutionary biology and very pro-ID. Like we could just like you could find this issue like philosophically interesting, even if you personally don't believe in evolution, and it would be like a fallback position then. Like everything doesn't have to depend on whether the bacterial flagellum can be explained through evolution or not. Like you could still keep your design intuitions intact. Like I think that would make like for a more robust design argument to have this kind of fallback position, even for those who think that evolution is probably not true.
Yeah, so you can see this as a hypothetical argument that if evolution were true, then you'd still need design. That's our kind of argument. Yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and advance here. Some try to argue from no design in biology to no design in the cosmos.
Yeah, so again, like we're quoting Dawkins because he's so quotable. Like he's such a terrific writer. even though we think he's a bit wrong about this particular issue. But so Dawkins tries to argue, like from the success of evolutionary explanations, in overthrowing design-based explanations. So he tries to take that and argues then against all design-based explanations. I'm just going to read this quote. Dawkins says that a deep understanding of Darwinism teaches us to be wary of the easy assumption that design is the only alternative to chance, and teaches us to seek out graded ramps of slowly increasing complexity. So after Darwin, we should feel deep in our bones suspicious of the very idea of design. So Dawkins argues from biology to the cosmic scale, but we could go in the other direction as well. So you could just go to the next slide. If we were to suppose that the fine-tuning design argument is good after all, as Luke Barnes and others have also argued on the Capturing Christianity show, then it's actually kind of weird if the products of all that fine-tuning, like the biology stuff, wouldn't give us any evidence of design, like any wouldn't show that design at all. Like it would only be in the laws and not at all in the products that are so complex and that appear so purposeful.
Yeah, so if you go to the next slide again, then we expand a bit more on this idea. So Dawkins again has another quote. He has a bunch of quotes, and we're using him not because he's the only evolutionary biologist we know of, but just because he's a good writer and puts some kind of central Darwinian ideas really, really clearly. So he says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And he contrasts that with physics. And he says physics is the study of simple things that do not tempt us to invoke design. But actually, the recent, or not even, I mean, just the last few decades of cosmology, if you accept the story that this is pointing to fine-tuning, or that cosmological parameters need to be fine-tuned in order to have life, then it seems that actually physics, which Dawkins says is so simple and doesn't need design, even physics actually needs design. So if it turns out that even physics, if studied carefully, looks like it needs design, then how much more might life need design? Because I think a lot of people are confused about this. The cosmological fine-tuning argument is not actually, it's not about life, but it's just about the life-permitting nature of the universe. So it just gives us basic astronomical structure like galaxies and stars. It's not fine-tuning for life per se. It's just fine-tuning for the kind of universe where life could exist. So life itself is actually much more complicated and looks much more purposeful than stars do, for instance. So Dawkins says that, we've got rid of design in biology, and physics doesn't even need design. But we're saying, well, actually physics looks like it needs design, and maybe biology does even more. We should take a more careful look at this.
Should we go ahead and advance, or Dr. Rope, would you like to say something else?
Do you have any questions on that, Cameron?
Yeah,
maybe
please,
or things that are not clear?
No, it's been sufficiently clear so far that we're kind of tying in the fine-tuning argument here at the beginning and then saying, it sounded like you were just saying that biology is just another level of sort of complexity that may cry out for some kind of explanation design-wise.
Well, even more so than the physics does. So Dawkins is pretty sure that physics doesn't need design, but actually the cosmological fine-tuning shows it needs extremely huge amounts of design, it seems, if we take the cosmological fine-tuning argument seriously.
Which I do.
But physics is so much more simple than biology. So that must mean that if we went with this argument, then biology would seem to need huge amounts of design, unless we really have a really convincing response. So this is just kind of setting up the question of what's explaining this apparent purposefulness in life.
Okay, so it sounds like you wanted me to jump in here a bit because this seems like a crucial move in the argument. Am I interpreting this correctly? Or is that maybe it's like a crucial intuition or like a crucial starting point for understanding?
It's just setting up. It's just setting up the argument.
We're trying to awaken your intuitions, like look inside your heart and see if you feel the same. But like we have a few more slides.
Okay, I'll pull those up.
Trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, it's starting to. I mean, it's getting the wheels turning. I would need to know a lot more details about biology before I could say that. Because I mean, the fine tuning argument makes a whole lot more sense to me. Biology is something that I just haven't personally got into, and so that's one of the reasons why I'm sort of just undecided about the whole ID thing and everything else. I mean, I've heard arguments on both sides, so yeah, I would just need more time to think about it. So maybe it'd be good. Maybe it'd be a good time to just progress through the slides. I'm sure going to get to a lot more information.
Yeah, I think just the key insight I wanted to communicate there is that physics is really simple, like Dawkins says, compared to biology. And it's surprising. I think it should be surprising that physics needs so much design. In order to get stars in a stable universe, you need a really precise fine-tuning. And that wasn't immediately obvious, I think. Whereas for most people through history, it has been obvious that you need some kind of special cause to explain biology. Yeah, that's the point I wanted to make.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Let's go ahead and progress here. I'll progress to the next slide. Why should evolution make design less apparent?
Yeah. So this is now we're starting to really get into the argument. And yeah, I'll just say the Kingsley one, and then you can continue maybe. So the question which Charles Kingsley, which is one of the early responders to Darwin, he was a Christian writer. Maybe he was a priest. I'm not sure actually, a theologian of some kind. And he said, "We knew of old that God was so wise that he could make all things, but behold." And so saying this, in light of evolution, he's so much wiser than that he can make all things make themselves. So he's suggesting that the kind of we should be impressed if God made everything, but we could be even more impressed if God made a system which could make itself. He's suggesting there's something there that's even more impressive. That's the kind of intuition that he's presenting.
Right. And we have a lot of analogies about this. Like you can think what would be more demanding? Would it be more demanding to build a house yourself, or would it be more demanding to build a machine that creates houses? Like Kingsley's intuition was that this kind of indirect creation is a lot more demanding. So one of my philosophical heroes in this discussion, Mats Wahlberg, asks based on this. So if it takes more wisdom to create through an evolutionary process than by hands-on design, and if structures created by hands-on design by humans are expressive of human intent and intelligence, why could not structures created by God in that more wisdom-demanding way reflect and divine intent and intelligence somehow? So, couldn't the products of this kind of mechanism also reflect design? And we do have some nice analogies to show this a bit further. But one quote that I also liked was actually by a few ID proponents arguing for the fine-tuning argument. So they said that, well, now that you have learned about the fine-tuning argument, isn't it so that you can appreciate the beauty of a rose better? Like the beauty of life in the universe, like when you know how precarious the conditions are that are needed for building life. Okay, so they argue like from fine-tuning towards the appreciation of life's beauty. Well, on the other hand, couldn't you also say like maybe life's ordered complexity is a kind of hint at the fine-tuning that stands behind this complexity, and somehow indirectly expresses then the creator's wisdom? But we'll get to that a bit later more.
Yeah, and this is a similar kind of point to something I raised before, that if God is designing the evolutionary process, then that makes God a cosmic level that's a cosmic level design, not just a kind of specific organ or organism or organelle or whatever, not just a specific molecule that God's designing. But if he's designing an evolutionary process, it's this big picture view of design. That's what we're trying to present here.
I really like the analogy that you gave of the building a house versus building a machine that can build a house. I think that was a good intuition pump.
Cool.
Cool beans. All right,
So
here we go.
Let's just one more intuition pump here before we get to some more intuition pumps. But so I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the Gettier problem, but I'll just explain it briefly. So Edmund Gettier
did you draw these pictures?
Famous.
No.
No, I like it's.
I think awesome.
It's openly accept. It's a usable, like it's commercially and publicly usable picture of the Gettier problem. So if you can't like read this, then I'll read them. So the basic idea of the Gettier problem is to question the usual definition of knowledge. Like knowledge is a justified true belief. So Gettier came up with these cases where it seems you have like a good reason to believe in something, like such as there's a sheep in the field, but your belief is still, and there actually is a sheep in the field, so your belief is true, but there's still something weird going on. Like let's say you see the sheep in the field, and you declare there's a sheep in the field, but so you like the sheep, you decide to go up to the little thing and pet it, but when you get there, there's a problem. It's not actually a sheep, it's a rock that is shaped like a sheep. However, when you look behind the sheep-shaped rock, you find an actual sheep. So you wonder, were you right when you declared that there's a sheep in the field? You were correct. You had good reason to think that there was a sheep in the field, but actually you had no way of knowing it. So this might be a little bit complex, but we think that if a theistic evolutionist denies the existence of evidence of design in biology, then in reality actually starts to resemble this kind of Gettier problem. Because, Nancy Murphy, whom I highly respect, as a researcher in science and religion, expresses this really well in a letter to Wahlberg. So Murphy says, before Darwin, Christians thought they were directly seeing, without intervening theory, God's intentions in nature. So now we know then that what appears to be design is not the direct manifestation of design, but instead we have to recognize that it only appears to be a direct manifestation of design. So it's only indirectly with theological knowledge can we still say that it is in a different sense the product of intention. So it's like when you bring in evolution, it's like you're showing that the initial intuition of design was wrong. Like biology actually didn't give you a reason to believe in design after all, because you've explained it through evolution. It was an illusion. You didn't need design. But then through theology, you actually learned that, well, actually there was design involved. So in that case, it seems like you have an illusion of design in biology. Yeah, you have like an illusion of design. So, yeah.
Yeah, so for the design argument
behind the illusion of design.
Yeah, so for the argument to work, it seems we want some kind of connection between the design and the appearance of design. Like we don't want it to be kind of accidental or so we when people see design, if that's real design, we want some way to explain why that's real design and why evolution doesn't completely undercut that appearance of design. So it seems to us that theistic evolution, I guess, doesn't have that, because they just say, oh, well, behind the rock, there was a sheep. Behind the design, there was a designer. Or behind the appearance of not design, there actually still was a designer. We want to say that there's a closer connection there, that there actually was real design behind the appearance of design, even though there was also evolution behind the appearance of design.
That was confusing to me.
So we want to say that there. Yeah. So like we think it's like possible to say that to take this traditional line and say that, well, we just believe in design because of our broader theology. It's just that it creates a pretty complex picture, and simplicity is a virtue of theories, and this kind of coherence. So it would increase the coherence of a theistic evolutionist view to be able to say that, show how these intuitions are actually still somehow correct, somehow truth tracking, so have some kind of good grounds.
Yeah, so I'm thinking maybe what it does, maybe this is one way of putting it, is that it just pushes the design back a step.
That's what we want to argue. Yeah.
From the biological level to the evolutionary level.
Yeah, that's what we want to argue. Whereas the theistic evolutionist will say, not really. I guess that that evolution is enough as an explanation, but we just basically by faith we trust that God was behind that, but we don't really see evidence of that. We can't make a rational inference based just on the biology. Whereas we want to say there is actually a way to make that inference based on that, basically on the biology.
The picture's starting to become clear now. So, I mean, one of the things that popped up in my mind immediately, and I assume that we may get to this a little bit later, is like, what do we mean by design? Because obviously a lot of people have argued that evolution entails a whole lot of suffering, and so can't be a really good designer. It's got to be and then also there's something called dysteleology, like bad design. So maybe that's going to come up a little bit later on like the nature of the designer, if we can.
That's going to come up.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the first thing
I guess before people throw out those objections, we need to see whether there is firstly a case for design. Because it might be that it looks like bad design, but it also looks like design. That would still be an interesting result. So we can't just argue from bad design to no design. I think that's something that we'll maybe get into a bit later.
Fair enough. All right, let me go ahead and pull the slides back up, and we'll go to the next one. Oh, part 3. Okay, good opportunity for some more questions that have come in. So let me go ahead and get to those really quickly. We've got 3 that have come in. We'll try to cover them as quickly as we can. So from Logical, Plausible, Probable, thanks for your super chat. He says, multiple 2021 papers in Nature formally state that the majority of the genome has function, specifically in relation to non-coding regions.
Yeah, so he's responding to what I said before and just disagreeing with me. That's fine. People can disagree, but it's going to come down to the definition of function. And actually, scientific papers generally don't say this. So the ENCODE papers back a few years ago did say this and got a lot of flack because they said that. And so now most people aren't saying function. They might say things like most of the genome is transcribed, means it's turned into RNA. But that's a different question. Whether something's transcribed is a different question to whether it's functional. And it's actually really difficult to define what counts as functional biologically. So I guess I would disagree with this. I don't think that multiple 2021 papers in Nature formally state that most of the genome has function. They might say that most of the genome does something biochemically, but that's most philosophers of biology say that's a different question.
Yeah, you're talking straight over my head. So I'm going to pull up the next comment and see if it's related here. I just by reading it, I have no idea. Logical, Plausible, Probable again. Do you actually think it's possible for multiplex codes to evolve? This is before even considering mRNA UTR necessities in relation to introns. None of this makes any sense to me. I don't know any of the biology, so feel free to help me and the audience out.
Yeah, so they're asking, how do you get like overlapping things in the genome where you have there's things in the genome that are a little bit like overlapping words in a letter, which both make sense. So sometimes in war or such, you want to send a secret message in a letter, and you can do that by like maybe every first line, the first letter of every line spells out a word. I mean, that's a really simple one. But there's other more complex codes. We kind of hide a message within a message. And there are things in the genome that do that. I think that's what they mean by multiplex. So there is this overlapping coding that's happening. And he's saying, how does that evolve? And this is, I mean, I say read my papers, basically. This is stuff that I've worked on, overlapping genes. And I think there's good reasons to think that some of this stuff has evolved, but it's really too technical to get into the details, unfortunately. Yeah, it's unfortunately that would require a whole lecture to explain some of that stuff. But if they read the literature, I think they'll see some evidence that this stuff is evolving. Yeah.
Dr. Rope, you have anything to add on this before we get to the next question? Oh, you're muted. Looks like your microphone's muted.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I don't really want to start lecturing about the technical issues either, especially as Zachary knows a lot more about this than I do. But one thing I could say that we do indeed have like some examples of bad design arguments that have been like overturned over time. Like we've found a better function for the supposedly badly designed feature, but we'll get to whether this solves the problem of bad design entirely later.
Okay.
I guess that comment's relevant to the last question on junk DNA. But yeah, anyway.
All right, let's get to this last question before we turn it over to, or before we advance to part 3. Leo Behe, what are some scientific predictions of intelligent design that its leading proponents have put forward, and are there any plans to test them and publish the results?
I think this is a good time to clarify that we're not talking about intelligent design. We're not defending intelligent design here. We're not, in terms of the capital I, capital D, intelligent design theory that people like William Dembski, Stephen Meyer, Michael Behe advocate. We're not doing that. So that's not our project. So their project is saying that intelligent design is a scientific theory, which is opposed to Darwinism. It's a better explanation than Darwinism. So it's just not that's not what I think is true, and it's not my task to try and explain their scientific research program. That's kind of a different. That's for them to defend, I guess. I think not for us.
Fair enough. All right. I think ready to move on to part 3. Let me go ahead and pull up our scene here, and Darwin and the EDA, Evolutionary Design Argument. It's a good name.
Good.
All right, whoever would like to begin.
Yeah, so this is, I think, really interesting because Asa Gray is fairly famous in these discussions. If you know some of the history on evolution and theistic evolution. So most people nowadays would put Asa Gray into the theistic evolution camp because he was a theist, he was an evangelical Christian, and he was an evolutionist. He was a friend of Darwin. He was a professor of botany, I think, at Harvard, and one of the main advocates of evolution in America straight after Darwin's books came out. So he was a big proponent of evolution, but he also believed that God was involved in evolution. So a lot of people would say, okay, he's a theistic evolutionist. But we want to say, actually, he was a proponent of the evolutionary design argument. So he was saying some things that are stronger than theistic evolutionists would say. And maybe Rupert can explain what he was saying.
Right. So I guess one thing that I could say is that theistic evolutionists are like a really varied bunch. So I wouldn't want to say that no theistic evolutionist would say this. Rather, I would guess that many theistic evolutionists might be very sympathetic to our argument. It's just that a lot of influential proponents of theistic evolution have taken the line that no evidence of design now comes from biology.
Yeah.
But yeah, so basically Gray's argument was that evolution doesn't provide like a third way between the like explanations of chance and design. Rather, it leaves the issue as it was before, basically, with the exception that actually this kind of process requires quite a lot of design. So Gray saw Darwin as contributing to natural theology and not diminishing it. And he and Darwin had a really long correspondence. Darwin didn't agree with all of his ideas, especially as they related to design. And we'll get to that, but we still see Gray as a really important predecessor of our argument.
Yeah, so this is explained, I think, in the next few slides. he has some really helpful analogies. I think so. This quote by itself doesn't really show very much, but the analogies I think help to really spell it out.
Right. So, like Gray mentions a lot of examples, but we've just chosen two here. Like Gray mentions the steamboat example, but I selected like a steam train here. So the analogy is with mechanics. Like if you have like a mechanical explanation of how the steamboat works, then you can give an explanation like this without ever mentioning the engineer who created the system. So mentioning the engineer is not needed to explain the operation of the train, how it goes forward, how it produces these and these effects. It's only needed to explain like the origin of the order. So this example just brings out the fact that there are at least some situations in which design and other explanations can really coexist, which was of course already recognized by Paley as well. But the other example is more interesting because here he comes like closer to an explanation where an apparently designed pattern is produced indirectly. Okay, one of the high-tech things in Gray's time was the mechanical loom. Like, so Gray asks us to recall a woman of a past generation, show her a web of cloth, then ask her how it was made. She will say that the wool or cotton was carded, spun, and woven by hand. Now, if you patiently explain to her the theory of carding machines, spinning jennies, and power looms, would her reception of your explanation weaken her conviction that the cloth was the result of design? No, it is certain that she would believe in design as firmly as before, and this belief would be attended by a higher conception and reverent admiration of a wisdom, skill, and power greatly beyond anything she had previously conceived possible. So Gray's point here is that, before Darwin, we might have thought that the order of biological organisms was like supernaturally created through a miracle. So that would have been wrong. And similarly, a woman or a man who looks at a piece of cloth might think that it's like handmade, but actually, it's even though it actually is produced through like a mechanical process. So Gray thinks that our design intuitions in nature are can still be correct even despite evolution, just as this person's intuitions about the designiness of the cloth can still be correct.
Yeah, so I think the general point is that a mechanical explanation or mechanistic explanation doesn't by itself get rid of the question of design or other causes if the mechanistic process had to be designed itself, which I think is pretty obvious. I don't think it should be controversial, but I think it's a really powerful point that, and it's a really nice analogy that someone in the 1800s who wasn't familiar with the new factories that were producing these things, if they saw a piece of cloth, they would think it was really intricately woven by hand. But then if they went to the factory, they'd be amazed at the complexity that was had to be designed in order to produce the cloth. And it's at least possible that the evolutionary process is something like that in order to get the kind of outcomes we see, maybe the evolutionary process also needs to be designed.
Yeah, this is all starting to make a lot more sense to me now. There's another objection that's popped up in my mind. Let me know if it's going to be addressed a little bit later. But now I'm thinking about like, it seems like you could take any process that's happened in the world or in the universe that we see, like the formation of stars, and provide a similar argument along those lines for design or the formation of stars, say. So would you say that that's like something that to be explored? Is it, what do you see as the relation between something like that, just some other kind of, mechanistic process unrelated to biology as serving some kind of evidence for design? Do you think that's, what are your thoughts on that?
I think stars give us less of an intuition of design. When you understand the physics of just what a star is, not how it came to be, but just what it is, what it's doing, it doesn't seem to be as purposeful, as obviously purposeful as life is. Like life is inherently teleological, it's goal directed. The machines in a cell, they're all operating together in order to produce a particular outcome. Stars don't have that. They're just a physical process that does its thing. So if you accept there's some kind of difference between life and just purely mechanistic things, and there seems to be that difference, that life is somehow teleological, then life is a better candidate for design arguments. That's the idea. That's the intuition.
It just still seems to me that in the case of the formation of stars, and I'm happy I chose that example because I feel like it's still relevant here, is that life requires stars on Earth. So if we didn't have the heat of the sun, then more than likely there'd be no life on Earth, or at least not in the kind of variety that we've got.
Right. Yeah.
So it seems like you could make a similar kind of. So here's I suppose what I'm thinking is that you could sort of combine the origin of the mechanism, the mechanistic story of evolution that explains biology, combine that mechanistic story account with the mechanistic account of how stars are formed. Do you see what I'm saying? How you can basically combine the two of those?
Yeah, I think the intuition is that the life side is going to be more interesting and it's going to require more fine tuning than the star side. I think that's basically the assumption that this was the intuition behind Paley and Paley's watch, that just the intricacy and functional complexity of life is higher, I think, undoubtedly, than the functional complexity of a star, which is pretty low. So you could add on that kind of argument, but it's not going to get you much more than just focusing on life itself.
Anything to add?
Yeah.
Dr.
So, yeah. Well, these are still just like analogies. So once we get like to the nuts and bolts of the argument, that it might become clearer, like why we apply it to some examples rather than others. But and we can come back to talk about the nuts and bolts of the arguments even more. We're trying to use analogies because we think it's like a lot easier to follow rather than just filling our slides with the logical premises and distinctions. But so in my book, The Compatibility of Design and Evolution, I try to develop a lot of objections to these analogies as well, and to the argument in general. And one objection then that I consider is like something like the following: let's say that life gives us evidence of design because it depends on fine tuning, like it somehow manifests the fine tunedness of the broader cosmos. Well, isn't this the case actually, that everything in the cosmos depends on the laws of nature and on fine tuning, like the formation of stars, for example, or the amount of gravel in my driveway, or the possibility of me committing a bank robbery, or something like that. So do all of these events and actions actually provide evidence of design because they depend on the fine tuning? So to give a brief answer, I just think some outcomes of the laws of nature and of the fine tuning obviously depend on quite a lot more fine tuning, or there's quite a lot closer connection between the background conditions, and quite a lot more is required, for example, for the evolution of life and of things like the human brain, or things like the bacterial flagellum, special outcomes like this when compared, say, to the gravel in my driveway. So it seems like these special outcomes are like in more need of explanation than the really simple and not so remarkable outcomes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go ahead and continue with the slides because we've got a lot more to get to, and we're already an hour and 20 minutes in. We're about just about halfway through. So we'll try to get through these a little bit quicker if we can.
Yeah, I think we can do it quickly. This is a similar example, which is really nice, the idea of an automated factory. And so, like, I think the factories that make Tesla cars are super automated. And anyone who thinks about that will realize that's a more impressive design required than the design to make a single car by yourself. The design of an automated factory is much more impressive. You can also, there are algorithms that will create music automatically, and then those algorithms still have to be designed. Is the main point there? Maybe Robert has more comments though.
Yeah. So the point here in both of these is actually that the design can still be evident in the end products. Like even if the designer doesn't have to intervene in the process itself, if the factory is like fully automated, then you don't have to have like a mechanician go there and put some parts in the car. But still, it's not so that it's only the structure of the factory that tells us about design. It's also the structure of the car that tells us that there has to be design at some point. So it's analogy, to make an analogy with fine-tuning, like it's not just the fine-tuning that gives us evidence of design, it's also the products of the fine-tuning, like these biological organisms. So the other example I take from Wahlberg, again, it's really interesting because this actually incorporates randomness. So if I just read a quote from Wahlberg when he uses this example, like it's clear that the programmer is responsible for things like the fact that what the computer spits out are structures that move within the Western tonal system, have determinate keys, are fugues, that means instantiate a certain form, they have a certain artistic style, and so on. So these are all properties that the programmer has intended and determined. So it seems that the computer-programmed fugue is expressive of the programmer's intent and intelligence, because these properties still require a good deal of intelligence to bring about. It's not easy to write a piece of music, and it's not easy to write a program that writes music either. So this program's results seem to indicate design, even though actually the user and the program of the program doesn't know all the specific details of what the music will turn out to be.
All right, should I go ahead and progress here?
Yes, I think Roper can explain this key response that Darwin made to Asa Gray.
Yeah, so Darwin had a few different responses, but in his autobiography, like when Darwin was writing The Origin of Species, he was a believer in God, so he says, but later in life he became more of an agnostic, and he didn't think that evolution, like he thought Gray's position was like okay, but he also criticized Gray a fair bit, and didn't think that evolution that evolution left the situation just as it was before. Like Darwin says that the old argument of design in nature fails now that the laws of natural selection has been discovered. There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. Everything in nature is the result of fixed laws. So in this portion of his autobiography, Darwin says that he's treating this, he has argued this more thoroughly in his earlier book, Variation, from 1868. So here his argument is mostly based on this analogy of an architect and a pile of rocks. Like Darwin says that, well, the properties of the pile of rocks are, of course, like determined by all kinds of natural forces. So if you assume that nature is created, then Darwin says, well, okay, these were created by God. Like this depends all on laws created by God. But still, if a human architect were to come and build a house out of these, or a bridge or some other structure out of these random rocks, then we shouldn't say like that God is responsible for the structure of the house. Like it's the human architect who just takes the out of the huge multitude of rocks, takes the rocks that just happen to, by chance, be fitting into the structure. So Darwin's point was that the random mutations in nature are like these rocks, like they aren't determined somehow by the laws of nature or by God. It's just, natural selection is shifting through the mutations, just like the architect shifts through the rocks, and natural selection is like the real explanation for the biological structure. So that's what he means, like that there's no more design, like in the details of biological structures, than there is like in the course which the wind blows. It's the result of fixed laws. It's something that is not necessarily intended by God.
Yeah, maybe we go to the next slide. Yeah, I think Roper can continue here as well.
Okay. So in one of Darwin's letters to Asa Gray, Darwin also comments on the issue of design. Like he says, I own that I cannot see as plainly as others do, and as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us, because there seems to me too much misery in the world. On the other hand, I cannot anyhow be contented to weave this wonderful universe, and especially the nature of man, and to conclude that everything is the result of brute force. I'm inclined to look at everything as resulting from designed laws, with the details, whether good or bad, left to working out of what we may call chance. So this is actually Darwin's own natural theology at this point. Like it was a natural theology. It was just very different from the Palean one. So Darwin talks here about designed laws and the small details, like the details of bad design, then left to chance. So along these lines, one could try to defend like an objection to our factory analogy and all the other analogies, and say that, well, evolution actually appears to be quite a bit more random than, say, an automated factory. Like we have this, all these meandering paths. You have all these species that have died out and gone extinct. You have the badly designed features of organisms, and so on. It doesn't seem like this kind of well-oiled machine, like the factory. So shouldn't this somehow undercut our analogy?
Yeah, and I think to respond to these is going to require getting more into the science of evolutionary theory a bit, and seeing which one does evolution actually fit better with. Does it kind of, is there some sense in what Gray is saying, or is it completely explained by natural selection, or whatever that is, as Darwin would basically think? So I think if we, I think in another session we're going to get into the science a bit more, and that might help to clarify the details of the argument. But we'll give some examples in the next few slides. I think at the end, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, the next section is part 4, which we've got some comments that have come in. So is this a good time to break?
Yeah, we can have more comments. Yeah.
Okay. So here's a couple more comments. This one from Carmel Crunk. Actually, I've got the wrong screen up. So let me hide this and get my screen where we can see everyone. No faces are cut off. So from Carmel Crunk, she says, is there evidence of natural laws, fine-tuning, and guided evolution?
Yeah, I guess that's what we want to argue that there is.
Yeah, so I read it wrong. Is there evidence of natural laws fine-tuning it and guiding evolution?
Yeah, so the details of that, I think, are going to have to wait till the next session when we really get into the science, some specific examples. This session is more just opening up the possibility that this argument could work, and explaining rebutting some of the philosophical objections to the whole project of trying to do this kind of evolutionary natural theology. But we would say, so there are potentially at least some examples. But this is explaining those examples is a work in progress, is the short answer. Yeah.
The only thing I was going to mention, you mentioned this session, and so we didn't really even tell the audience yet, but this is technically a part 1. We're going to do a part 2 where we talk more about the science. This one is on the philosophical side, just kind of setting the argument up. And then in the next one, basically very similar to this, we've got planned something that's going to deal a little bit more in depth with the science. So yeah, look forward to that. And anything else to add, Dr. Roper, before we get to the next question?
You're muted.
You're muted again.
Was going to add that we do have a few teasers about the science in part 4, and let's see if we can say a little bit about those as well.
Great. All right, from Sentinel Apologetics. He says, Cam, stars are fine-tuned PP chain nuclear fusion objects that then become supernova to generate star stuff, the periodic table, that then become organic life, resulting in evolutionary design.
I don't know what the point of that is.
It was probably related to my comment earlier about the mechanisms that create stars and whether or not we can infer design. Okay.
Yeah. Don't know. Stars are a prerequisite of life. I think that's interesting. That's why the fine-tuning argument of a bunch of those parameters that people discuss in that context are about stars, because that's what the physics can deal with. But it doesn't get us life per se. That requires a bit more.
Right. Okay. All right. That's going to do it
carbon, maybe.
That's going to do it for some questions. Thank you guys for sending these in. And then we'll jump right back into the presentation. So part 4, the in principle compatibility. See what that's all about.
Yeah, so we want to explain
how
is it really possible to have both evolution and design in principle. So we spell this out a bit more. And Roper gave these two examples.
Right. So the thing is that we do need to show both kind of examples. Like there are clearly examples where giving an explanation does make it so that we don't need the previous explanation anymore. For example, when I was a kid, there was like a lot of hubbub about these so-called crop circles, at least a little bit. Like people, it's one of these stereotypical UFO evidences. Like you have this kind of strange circles appearing in crop fields. Like could it be aliens that made this? So then we have actually had some cases where people came up and did like videos and stories about this, and UFO experts came and said, well, there's no natural explanation that is possible, that this had to have been created by aliens. And then later on they were embarrassed by video evidence brought by a couple of hoaxsters who had gone in the middle of the night and had done this. Okay, so here it seems like then we don't need the hypothesis of aliens anymore. Like, but we could of course still come up with some way of harmonizing these explanations. Like we could say that, well, maybe the hoaxsters were under alien mind control, so that's why the UFOs were still responsible, even though we have like video evidence of these guys doing it. So just this kind of logical compatibility doesn't seem to in this case retain the crop circles as evidence of alien intelligence. But then we have other kinds of examples where there is really like a clear compatibility between design and other processes, like a lot of the examples that we went through previously. And of course, the classic example of Socrates is death from poison. Yes, you could give a kind of complete explanation of how Socrates died by just looking, well, if you drink this kind of poison, then you're going to die. But this will still leave out quite a lot of important explanations, like why Socrates thought that it was better to stay in Athens and drink the poison rather than go into exile, and that's gonna require like understanding his intentions and morality and his belief in the afterlife. and so on. So here the natural explanation is like compatible and doesn't explain away at all the explanation in terms of intention. And same thing with the factory example and with the music example. Here it's also not explained away. Okay, so I guess I'll explain a bit about this as well.
Yep.
Like this is just an overview of a few different ways of then going into the nuts and bolts of how the compatibility is possible. Like one way would be to argue that there's kind of a causal chain here, like one explanation depends on the other. There's the common distinction between a proximate and ultimate explanation, like maybe evolution could be then dependent on design or on chance. So you could say it's something like, well, this design argument actually then just like evolution just pushes back the problem to a more fundamental level. Like we still have to ask then, is it more probable that evolution can produce this kind of wonderful results by chance or by design? And just based on the end result, I mean, you could say that, well, this kind of end result still seems more probable by design than by chance. Then you could also try to argue that there is indeed just create an account which shows how the products of a larger whole, like the products of evolution or the products of a factory, can really reflect the rationality of the whole. That would help show how this kind of intuitive design perception can still be accurate even despite evolution. Or even if you end up like saying that the actual structure of biology doesn't provide evidence anymore, you could still try to argue that whatever is lost from the power of the biological design argument would then have to be compensated by additional fine-tuning to make evolution possible. All right, so we do have a lot of slides like going through this in a little bit more detail. So maybe we can move on.
Yeah, so there's a kind of basic distinction between proximate or local explanations and ultimate or kind of global or final explanations. I'm actually not sure what the throwing the stone example is. Maybe Rupa can clarify.
Yeah, well, it's like an everyday example. Like if you throw a stone and you break a window, then it's like the proximate explanation for the window breaking would be like the stone hits it. But the more ultimate example then would be like someone threw the stone, for example. So one thing that I find interesting is that in biology, quite a lot of biologists want to have this some kind of distinction between proximate and ultimate explanations anyway. So, for example, like in the biological development of a new organism, like it's explained by these physical forces, like it's explained by the DNA and how the cell uses the DNA to create certain kind of structures. Then the cell multiplies and the cells specialize in a certain way. And this process of biological development like explains in a way how you came to have a nose and eyes and so on. But then the evolutionary biologist will want to say that, well, there's a more fundamental explanation, like there's an evolutionary history between how these processes evolved. Then the proponent of EDA would just want to add one more level there, it's more ultimate level. How can it be so that evolution is possible?
Yeah, so someone like Ernst Mayr. So someone like Ernst Mayr stressed that the ultimate explanation in biology is natural selection, but there might be a bunch of other proximate kind of local explanations. But at least when it comes to adaptation, he would stress that ultimately it's going to go back to natural selection. But our suggestion is, well, maybe there's actually another step further, which is maybe natural selection itself has to be designed. And we'll explain a little bit more why we think that could be the case.
So I'll just go through the last point there still on the previous slide. One thing that's done in the philosophy of explanation, one way to understand how different explanations might coexist is to say that they're answers to at least somewhat different explanatory questions. So you would have to say that there's some kind of explanatory question that's still left unexplained by just your standard evolutionary biology. Like, yeah, it might explain how certain certain structures that appear purposeful actually appear, but maybe there's like a further question, like how is it possible for such evolution to happen? How is it possible for such structures to evolve, and so on. And as long as there's some kind of explanatory question that design can answer better, or where design can add some explanatory power, then the issue of simplicity doesn't remove its need. Right, so we can go on.
Yeah, so one specific scientific example, which we'll probably unpack more next session, is this whole phenomenon of convergent evolution. And that's the idea that evolution seems to end up in a similar place independently, time after time. So one of the most famous examples is that there's a bunch of mammals in Australia that are marsupial. So they're a whole different branch of mammals, but they end up looking very similar to different branch of mammals that were found in Europe or Africa, for instance. So you end up with forms. So there's a marsupial mouse that looks very much like a normal mouse, but they're very distant evolutionarily. Their common ancestor was a long time ago, more than 100 million years ago. So evolution seems to do this again and again. It ends up with the same kind of structure, even though they're not actually directly related. So this phenomenon of ending up at a similar place again and again seems to suggest some kind of directionality to evolution. Because if evolution really could go anywhere at all, it would be incredibly surprising that it should end up at such a similar place again and again. So evolution seems to be highly constrained, and someone like Simon Conway Morris suggests that the possibilities of evolution are really restricted, and that somehow points to some kind of directionality maybe to evolution. So if it's really surprising that evolution should end up in the same place again and again, then that seems to be a pointer that this may be room for some other deeper explanation of why does evolution have this structure, when it, as far as we can tell, it could go anywhere. Questions or comments on that, Cameron?
No, I don't have any comments at this point.
Right. So the point here is just that, also that evolution seems to kind of depends on this kind of general laws of form, or somehow the laws of nature. It's not just like in Darwin's analogy, where the architect just takes up like a random pile of rocks and just builds it based on the unique circumstances in a kind of highly contingent way. It seems like natural selection is the expression of these deeper laws. In this case, it seems like it's acting like kind of a search engine here. It's not just sort of creating the forms, it's discovering forms that were somehow already written into the laws of nature in this way, and it's discovering the same forms all over again. And this seems to really fit pretty well with the factory analogy and with Asa Gray's argument.
Yeah, so this is just one example, and there's a bunch more, some of which we'll briefly sketch this time, but some of which we'll go into more detail next time. So I think we can keep going.
Yeah, we'll try to get through these. We've got about, looks like a little under 20 slides to go, so about 17, I think. So we'll try to get to these as quickly as we can. We're coming up on the 2-hour mark, but we'll nevertheless finish all the slides regardless. So, but yeah, all right, let's continue.
Yeah, so one of the pictures that's used is like evolution is like searching through a library. And this is the picture that Andreas Wagner suggests. And the library is the different structures that evolution results in. I think that the point that some people, including Wagner, makes is this library has a really interesting structure. It's not just that evolution can go anywhere and do anything, but actually, in order to get to complexity, there's only certain routes that could be taken, and the connections between different organisms seem to be highly structured in a way that kind of standard evolutionary theory, I think, wouldn't have expected. It wouldn't have expected this kind of structure within the possibility space that allows for evolution to happen. It's quite technical to talk about how this actually works on the molecular level. But I think just the point that evolution seems to have a kind of structure that allows for complexity, which a lot of people, including the experts working on this area, like Andreas Wagner, seem to find really surprising, that it should have this kind of structure. I think we can go to the next. We're just going to have to really quickly summarize these things. So a really nice example of this design issue is, it seems like maybe evolution just pushes the problem of design back. And a clear example of that is from Richard Dawkins again. He has this analogy where imagine you start with random sequences, but you want to find a particular target. So he has this phrase from Shakespeare, and he thinks it's like a weasel. And he says, well, it's easy. If you just change one letter at a time, if every time you get the right letter, you keep it there, then actually quite quickly you'll get to this whole sentence. So if you give like a higher score for getting the right letter in the right place, then this algorithm will find this whole sequence relatively quickly. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So if you start from complete randomness, changing one letter at a time, if you have the target sequence specified, and if you stick to the target letter once you get it at each position, then you can get there. And he says, well, evolution is like that. But this is a really teleological analogy. Like this whole system only makes sense if you have a target which is built into the system, and which you reward when you get that target. So thinking of evolution like this is actually quite strange. It seems really teleological. It seems you really need to build in a really specific target in order to get evolution to work. And that's actually not how people have, like materialists have thought about evolution. They haven't thought it had any particular target. But maybe Ropa has more comments on that.
Yeah, I guess we should mention that there's quite a lot of different simulations of evolution, and not all of them have like a built-in target. But the simulations are still really interesting in that they do also allow us to study situations in which evolution would and wouldn't happen, and what kind of conditions the creators of the simulations have to build in order for evolution to happen. Like this, some really interesting examples, like the use of these simulations to design a new antenna by NASA engineers, where obviously they didn't have the final design of the antenna in mind before they made the algorithm, but still they did have to design their algorithm really carefully in order to produce the antenna. Then there's there's a lot of these simulations, so they seem to show that actually, again, the compatibility of evolution and design. A designer can work through an evolutionary process. We have actually observed this in the case of these algorithms, and they do also show that you can't just take any kind of conditions and just plop in random mutation and natural selection and expect interesting results to happen. Like you actually do have to design quite a lot into there, how the selection works.
Yeah, so it seems a general truth that if you want interesting results, you really shouldn't expect them unless you've designed the algorithm in a particular way. So it seems surprising to get certain kinds of functional complexity unless you really carefully fine-tune your algorithm to get that kind of complexity. That seems to be a general lesson. I mean, this is controversial, but this is something that might be a reasonable conclusion based on the literature on these kinds of algorithms. And if that was the case, then it seems you can pretty straightforwardly build a design argument from the analogy in evolution. If evolution is working like these evolutionary algorithms, which a lot of evolution biologists would say, yeah, that's what it's doing.
Yeah, this is reminding me of something that I heard from Dr. Josh Rasmussen. He's, I don't know if you've heard this, Zach, but...
I've heard it, yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the first things he did was he was tasked with building a computer program that built, through evolution, built a biological organism. Well, in a computer program, obviously, but he found that it was a lot more difficult than he was anticipating and had to do a whole lot of designing in order to make it happen. So yeah, that does help me see the argument a little bit clearer as well. That through these different programs, you've got to do a whole lot of designing in order to even get the program up and running. If your goal is to have a sort of complex organism at the end of it, as opposed to just chunks of matter floating around, not interacting. So yeah.
Yeah. So when I've heard Josh mention that, he ties it just quickly. He ties it with the fine tuning argument, but I'd say this is kind of separate because fine tuning is not giving you that kind of life. So that this is a biological design argument, which is kind of the next level on top of the cosmological physical fine tuning.
Yeah, and just to clarify again and make the argument more explicit, like let's say you know absolutely nothing about computer programming, but you see that a genetic algorithm, like a simulation of evolution, has created like this kind of interesting antenna structure. Then you can ask, like, is it more probable that a simulation could produce this result through being well designed, or is it more probable that the simulation just did this by chance, like the designers didn't do anything at all to ensure an interesting outcome? I just think it's vastly more probable, even without knowing anything about computer design, that they really had to do something to make the program do such an interesting result. So just apply that to the cosmos. Like if evolution produces an interesting result, then is it more likely that the cosmos did this by chance or by design?
And I think this helps to clarify that this really is a philosophical interpretation of the data. We're not saying evolution doesn't work. We're not saying, we're not doing anything that challenges evolutionary theory. We're actually saying, okay, given that evolution does work, what kind of world do we need to live in, and what's the best explanation for that world at a metaphysical level, which is not a scientific question in a straightforward way. Yeah.
All right, let's continue through the presentation. So part 5, bad design. We don't have any more questions that have come in, so we'll just continue forward here. Yeah, I like how you guys have basically prepared to talk about all the objections I raised. All right, here we go. Yeah, so I'll just say quickly that we'll talk through more of the specific scientific examples. Those were just kind of teasers for the next time, where we'll go into some more detail for people who want to think about evolutionary theory in more detail. But the big objection, obviously, to design arguments, one of the main ones that you'll hear is either bad design or evil design. And maybe Ropa can go through this quote from Hume.
Well, I mean, I'm not a native speaker, but I'll read it gladly. So Hume, again, in his nice book, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, also has a great way of stating this objection. Inspect a little more narrowly these living existences, the only beings worth regarding, how hostile and destructive to each other, how insufficient all of them are for their own happiness, how contemptible or odious to the spectator. The whole presents nothing but the idea of a blind nature impregnated by a great vivifying principle, pouring forth from her lap without discernment or parental care her maimed and abortive children. Hume compared the universe to like a poorly built house where the tenants are living in suffering and really poor conditions and squalor, and we are so vulnerable, we are so unable to take good care of ourselves. And Hume argues that this is actually a lot more probable on the basis of no design than on the basis of design.
Yeah, I think we can
a
go
lot
to
of people have thought this is really powerful.
Yeah. So Darwin quite famously has an example of a particular parasite that feeds on caterpillars. I think Dawkins raises the same example. Also, just the whole phenomenon of carnivory, that creatures eat each other to survive. So when Darwin saw this stuff, he said he's not so sure that the eye is expressly designed, given that there's other complex things in life look like they're not the kind of thing that a good designer would create. So this is part of his dialogue with Asa Gray. Maybe next slide.
And just to, I'll just add one more thing, because we didn't go through the fact that the idea of bad design and evil design are really two distinct objections. One way that you could argue against design is like pointing the feature of life that are not perfect. Like if we were to design like the perfect human being, we would probably make them immortal. We would maybe want to give it like the capacity of flight. Maybe we wouldn't have like back problems and so on. We would create creatures maybe that live in an absolute state of bliss all the time. You could try to argue from bad design like less than optimal design, but then there's these examples where it seems like it's evil design, like creatures eating each other, like these really ugly parasites that attack humans as well and cause all kinds of complications. Like you have the malarial parasite, you have like a plague-bearing bacteria and all this kind of stuff. So I tend to think that the examples of bad design are comparatively a lot easier to explain.
Yeah.
Like idea proponents do have a lot of good strategies there, like and they can point to many examples where previous design that we used to think was bad, like the reverse wiring of the human retina. Like we used to think that that's bad design, like it's actually apparently good design after all. But the evil design is more difficult, I think.
Yeah, so on the next slide, our general thought on this is that this is not a particular objection to the evolutionary design argument per se. It's a problem for theism, regardless of your particular account of origins or design or such. It doesn't seem that I think it doesn't seem to either of us that theistic evolution really gets you out of this in special ways, or that old earth creation does. But there are some resources that each of these have, but most of these resources will be also useful for us. So the different theodicies that are available could also be offered on an evolutionary design picture. So that this is not an objection to evolutionary design arguments just by themselves. I think it's a general problem for theism, and a bunch of the resources that different camps have will actually be applicable. And maybe Roper can outline the different options.
Well, Zach, I liked what you said earlier. It's just like when it comes to design, you want to give an argument from bad design. That's still an argument for design. You just, you want to say that that's going to lead you some way in terms of what kind of inferences you can make about the properties or the attributes of the designer in question. But at the same time, you're still able to conclude that design happened, even if it is on the surface bad design.
Yeah, it's not, at least just kind of taken literally, it's not really good. It's not a good response to the design argument per se. It's
From
an
bad design,
objection
you can't
to
go to no design.
Yeah. It's an objection to the character of God. It's saying that this designer doesn't fit with, say, the Christian God. Therefore, there's kind of internal incoherency in your position. That's what the atheist who offers this is trying to say. But we think this is a general problem for, well, I would say anyway, it's a general problem for theism. And personally, I would be quite happy to kind of trade off the design argument and the problem of evil, or some of these arguments. I'm fine if these kind of balance each other out in some way. All I want to say with the design argument is this is evidence for theism. And there's other things that might be evidence against theism. That's okay. We've got to look at all the arguments. And if people were happy to do a one-for-one trade, I'd be very happy with that, because there's a bunch of other arguments for theism. And there's not really a bunch of other arguments for atheism. But that's my kind of personal intuition response to problem. I think problem of evil is a massive problem, which is a good example of that is these apparently bad design, or apparently evil design especially. But there are some theodicies which can be offered in response to this. And given the huge weight, I think, of the various design arguments, to some extent, you just have to kind of trade some of these things off, that not everything's pointing in the same direction. That's just the nature of the world. That's just the complexity of the world that we see. And everyone who picks a position on this is trading some arguments for others, or preferring some arguments over others.
Dr. Rope, did you have anything to say?
So, quite a lot. Like we could talk for an additional 3 hours just about this stuff. But I mean, we do have a few potential responses on the slides as well. Like usually when theists want to address the problem of evil, we would want to ideally find a strategy which somehow says that, well, it's not actually God's fault. Maybe God has a good reason for allowing evil, but we would simultaneously still want to say that God is to be thanked for the good in nature, in biological nature. God is somehow responsible, even for biology's beauty in some way, but still say that maybe some details of it are caused by some other process allowed by God. So it's there's a lot of different responses that we could give, and it can get a bit technical to go through. But maybe I could go through, just very briefly explain just the two that we have here on the slides.
All right, I'll go ahead and pull them back up here.
Yeah. Just go to the previous one.
Oh, keep it here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So usually, like, people do want to argue against intelligent design and try to say that it makes the problem of evil somehow worse. And this critique can come particularly from evolutionary creationists or theistic evolutionists who would want to say that, well, if we don't have to hold God responsible for the evolutionary process, if we don't have to say the products of that process as designed and intentioned, but rather as the products of designed laws, like Darwin said, then maybe this would absolve God of the responsibility. Like some theistic evolutionists, like Francisco Ayala, even say that intelligent design is a form of blasphemy for this reason, that it makes God responsible for all these badly designed features in biology and all this evil design. Like it's much better to say that, well, no, it's not God, it's just evolution, and rather say that God's not responsible for the outcomes of evolution. But you could have like different versions of this. You could say that, well, maybe God is actually responsible for evolution in some way, but maybe God still allows creatures some role in shaping the direction of evolution. So God isn't completely responsible. Like creatures could construct their own lives, live their own lives in some way that contributes to what kind of selection pressures then occur, and this would then lead to some outcomes that God doesn't really ultimately prefer. So the other alternative would be to argue that there's been some kind of a fall, like the human fall in young Earth creationism is thought to explain, and the curse that followed the human fall is thought to explain all the evil design in nature. But the old Earth creationists can also, and theistic evolutionists can also appeal to a fall, and so can we. For example, you could try to argue that God foreknew that a human fall was going to occur, so that's why God created an imperfect world that would be a fitting place for sinful humanity to live. Or you could go like the route of David Bentley Hart here and John C. Peckham, and say that God acted in his creation together with angelic powers and gave them some creative some input into the evolutionary process, and then part of the angels used this power to corrupt God's good creations. So you could do either of these, and there are a lot of other replies as well. The one problem, of course, is the whole evaluation of optimality and the goodness of nature. Like, to what extent can we do that?
Yeah, so I guess I would say that
we could go on.
I would just quickly say that I think the overall harmony of nature, or the interactions within the biosphere, that's one sense in which I think the world is clearly good. So there's different levels. Like individual things might be bad within it, might seem bad, but if the overall, to some extent, maybe the overall structure balances some of it out in some way. So that's one of the considerations that I personally like anyway. That the world as a whole is good. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything within it is pointing in the same direction.
All right, let's try to power through the rest of these slides here. We got about 11 left.
Like personally, like I would rather quit early than try to go through this too quickly. Like we can leave the rest to later if you think we should wrap up. But maybe we can go through the last final slides on the problem of evil at least. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. Is that what the rest are about? Is it the problem of evil?
No, it's a few slides on the problem of evil, and then on part 6 we have a lot more objections, and that's it. Then it's
okay. I'm kind of figuring this out on the fly as we go, because it all sounds really important, but I can also see doing a whole show on. Well, so let's do this. We've got some people here in the live chat that are watching live with us today. So if you would like us to do another show where we basically just look at objections to this, and then we also, I think this is where the value could come in doing a separate show, is that we could take questions and objections from the live audience. So not only would we do, like, say, the first half of the show covering some of the common objections that you guys have prepared, but then also just answer questions from the live audience. What are your thoughts on that? I kind of like that idea.
I think it'd be helpful to get some of the science details as well, though. So it's up to you how that fits in, but there's a bunch of material, and actually giving in the same way that the cosmological fine-tuning requires specific scientific examples, there's a bunch of stuff that I can say on the scientific examples that I think will give this more plausibility. There's another element to it.
We're kind of just thinking out loud, so those of you watching, just go with us. Yeah, so what I'm thinking is that what we could do is still do that whole episode on the biological side of things. I think that'd be worth doing, even if it's a little bit shorter of an episode, say an hour long or an hour and a half or however long. I think that doing a separate episode on that would be beneficial. I mean, I've done a show with Luke Barnes where all we talked about were the examples of fine tuning from physics, and we didn't give like the overall sort of argument, the meta level argument from fine tuning for the existence of God or anything. We just covered the examples. So I think we could do the same thing in your case and do that as a separate show, and then we could do another show where it's basically just covering objections to the EDA. I think that'd be a really sensible way of going. What do you guys think?
Yeah, that's good. I'm just looking at some of the slides. How do you want to wrap it up then?
Is there anything that we can cover in this last section, because we haven't made it to part 6 yet? So maybe why don't we finish out this part 5 and then end it there? How about that?
My suggestion is, if we're going to do a separate show on the objections, then we could leave these and come back to it once we spout out the argument a bit more, and we could finish just on kind of a positive note. The last few slides, just pointing out some positive directions that this can go, and as a teaser for next time maybe.
All right, where should I go with the slides? Is that
I think
the very last slides?
I think we raised the problem of evil, so we do have to say a little bit more about it. So just go through those slides and then jump to the end, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah. So then we'll end on a positive note. But please go back to the previous one still. And one more.
The next one.
One
Yeah.
to the next.
Which one? Go forward.
The next one from this one. Yeah.
Forward.
Oh.
Am I?
The next one?
Do I still have the wrong one? Okay. I feel like.
Is this the right one, Roper?
No,
we haven't done the previous.
Too much forward. Yeah.
Go previous to previous.
Here we go. That's good. That's excellent. Yeah.
Sorry. Now I've lost
one forward.
This one.
This one.
There you go. That's great. Yeah. Well, this show is also like whenever you're teaching, like it's always a combination of design and chance. So yeah. So we actually think that if this kind of evolutionary theodicy is possible, then this would fit with our argument really well.
Yeah.
Like even if it wouldn't fit with intelligent design as well, or well, maybe ID also does allow for some freedom in nature's processes, but so there's been like several authors who present this kind of defense of design in nature while still allowing for not everything to be intentional. Like with the automated music composition analogy, design is evident in the end result, but it's not responsible for all details. Like there's still a certain rationality that's present in the biological organisms. They're living their own lives in a way that requires quite a lot of purposeful structures and so on, but maybe their actual way of life might also be impacted by other factors like just random evolutionary accidents or things like that. So Mats Wahlberg, for example, even applies this very bravely to the malarial parasite and says that it's expressive of divine intent and intelligence by virtue of being capable of displaying rather clever functional behavior. However, the specific kind of functional behavior it displays does not need to have been intended by God. Christopher Southgate similarly says that even this parasite expresses something of the fecundity and generativity of creation, and in this way expresses divine glory, as hard and troubling though it is to say, and as unintended as the specific way of life is, according to Southgate.
Yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. I think Roper can keep going through.
So, okay, I'll just power through then this one as well. Okay, so what this kind of evolutionary theodicy has been suggested in the literature quite a lot, but it's not necessarily like without its own problems. like one of the central ones is how you how do you actually make this theodicy in such a way that God isn't responsible for evolution, particularly when you note how evolution does depend on like these divinely created laws. So doesn't God create all the possibilities that are available for evolution? And why doesn't God prevent some evolutionary outcomes? Like are the in what sense could an evolutionary process be really free in the same way as like human beings might be free to at least some extent make these moral choices as in the free will defense? Like it's not all that clear necessarily, but insofar as an evolutionary theodicy like this is possible, then it can also be adapted for use by the EDA proponent. So the EDA proponent doesn't have to say that all the details of biology are designed. Like they just have to say like that the overall orderliness of biology or overall teleology shows some kind of signs of divine intentionality, and that it somehow manifests like the fine-tunedness of the cosmos.
Yep. And last slide on problem of evil.
Yeah, which I just took a peek at it, and I think it's going to be the perfect slide to kind of wrap up.
Yeah. So Saint Augustine already talked about this quite a lot, and so did a lot of the other church fathers, a lot of theologians during the Middle Ages, and it's not like it's a problem that has gone totally undiscussed in the history of theology and philosophy. So Augustine writes like this in his City of God: it's ridiculous to condemn the faults of beasts and trees, even though they have these properties that seem to be harmful for each other and for themselves, even though these creatures are not capable of sustaining themselves indefinitely and so on. Because these creatures recede from the Creator's hand and existence fitting to them. For things earthly were neither made to be equal to things heavenly, nor were they, though inferior, to be quite omitted from the universe. So the last point that I would like to make on the problem of evil here is just that our notions of good and evaluating the good is really a pretty complex matter. Like it's dependent on our theology, and we can have like quite differing estimates of the relative extent and relative badness of the design in nature. John Garvey has a recent really interesting book on God's Good Earth, where he tries to answer to the examples of Darwin and others, and he argues, for example, that the victims of the parasitic wasps don't really suffer because they're insects and they are not as capable of suffering, at least, as the other organisms. And he would also argue that the predation that we see in nature generally targets creatures that would have died of old age or so on anyway, and it's not something that's usually resulting in that great suffering, and that the majority of animal lives are actually rather happy. So you could try to make an argument along these lines for the goodness of creation, and for the argument that the problem of good in nature greatly outweighs the problem of bad and the problem of evil in nature. So I don't think this succeeds in entirely answering the problem, but it might help in putting it in a proper perspective. And also, like a lot of people would say that the evolutionary process itself is like this nature red in tooth and claw. It's just creatures killing each other and fighting all the time, and millions of years of suffering that then brings us about. But actually, this is like a pretty simplistic picture of evolutionary theory. It also does include quite a lot of cooperation between creatures, after all, and not just a bloody competition. And if you talk about the millions of creatures that have lived during evolutionary years, then you do have to think that not their lives haven't been like filled with suffering. Because Lewis famously said that nobody experiences the entire aggregate of suffering. So it's just it's the examples of suffering that are horrible, felt by individual creatures that should concern us, not necessarily the length of evolutionary history. Because when you lengthen it, you just also increase the amount of happy creatures, not just the amount of suffering.
Have you read the paper by Proust and Doherty, The Problem of Anomaly, or something? I can't remember the name of the paper, but it's something along the lines of anomaly. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Well, it seems like somewhat related to what you were just arguing about how when we look at these really horrible cases, those tend to move us and those tend to really be challenging to think about and everything. But you can think of those as kind of anomalies. Just like in evolutionary theory, there's anomalies like the evolution of the eye that seems to pose a challenge, but then you can provide some kind of account of, I mean, from what I understand, biologists have been able to forward theories of how eyes would have evolved naturally. So
yeah, I don't think the eye is really an anomaly. But in general, this whole topic, I would say, is kind of just a separate thing, and it's something that all theists face, and it's not really a specific objection to our argument. So yeah, even if it's an objection to theism, that for me that's fine. That's okay. That's kind of a separate discussion that theists and atheists can have. But it's helpful just to really focus on, okay, is there evidence from biological design? Because maybe at least it's going to help balance out some of the apparent evidence in the other direction. I think it'll be helpful just to really quickly highlight some of the science, again, because this is trying to be an argument in light of the science. So maybe if we go to the slide with the kind of looks like mountains. Yeah, so this one, I mean, we can talk about a bunch of these things more, but I think this is also scientifically interesting, that scientists can do some stuff that will be interesting and helpful here. So evolutionary biologists think about evolution as moving through a fitness map. And one of the key questions is, what is the shape of those maps? And do they have to be the way they are? Are they, I would say that the maps that we have must have been really finely tuned in order to result in the kind of complexity we see. That only a tiny subset of possible maps would result in something like the human brain or whatever. And there's a fine-tuning argument there. Because otherwise, I think we would generally expect evolution to not be as fruitful as it was. We can study this through evolutionary simulations, like we've mentioned. How hard is it to get the interesting outcomes? We can also ask, like the convergence topic, are there patterns in evolutionary outcomes that seem somewhat surprising, but maybe make sense if there's some kind of design behind it? And also, are there strange or highly unexpected events in evolution itself? There's an example in astronomy where the creation of the moon seems to have been a highly improbable event, but it's necessary for the Earth and maybe for life as we know it. It was kind of a really incredibly improbable collision that caused the creation of the moon. I think there's similar events in evolutionary history which are really improbable, but necessary for the later development. And I think there's potential to discuss these within an evolutionary design picture as well. Then next slide, and then the next one. Yeah, so these are the things that I'll spell out next time. There's a whole range of possible evolutionary design arguments that you could make. You could make arguments from outside biology that allow evolution to happen, things like astronomy or geology. You could argue from the initial conditions of evolution. You can argue from the overall shape of evolution, the parameters of evolution, and you can argue from evolutionary outcomes, specific events in evolution or results of evolution that seem surprising, but less surprising if there's a designer. And so come back next time to hear about these things.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited to do the show on biology because when I did the one on fine tuning with Luke Barnes, I learned a ton in that one about the different cases. So I'm really looking forward to get into some of the biology. And I promise, Zach, I promise I'm going to be conversational in that episode so that we're like some of the stuff you're going to be talking about. Just I'm sure is going to go over my head, but I'm going to keep you grounded. But it's just going to be fun. So it's gonna be a good time. I mean, and Dr. Rope, he's gonna be there too. So it'll be another good time. Right. But then the other show that we talked about earlier that we're definitely going to do is on objections to the EDA. This is really cool. It's fun to be part of something that is sort of. Would you both say that this is new? I mean, maybe the way that you're developing it is new, but it's kind of at the very beginning of the stream we kind of looked at like some of the potential crumbs of this argument historically.
Yeah, so Asa Gray had a similar argument, but I think we can really flesh it out, both because of developments in like the philosophy of science through explanation and developments in the biology. So we understand what evolution is a lot better than Asa Gray did. So we can start to spell out some of the possible overlaps in much more detail than he could. But it's not it's not completely new, but it's being developed.
Well, I also really like this pairing of like we've got an evolutionary biologist and we've got a theologian, philosopher of religion. So it's like a perfect pairing, I think, to really forward a good, solid argument where we're marrying the philosophy with the science. Not to say, Zach, that you're not good at philosophy, but I mean, you see the value in having a philosopher on too. So
yeah, for sure. And Ropa has written a book specifically on this. I'm actually his sidekick here. People should check out that book that's coming out later this year.
Excellent. All right. Well, is there anything that you guys would like to say to
interdisciplinary thing? So yeah.
Yeah, that's excellent. Is there anything that you'd like to leave with the audience, at least in this part of the series of videos that we're going to be doing, evidently?
I'd just say that people should take the design argument seriously. It doesn't require being anti-evolutionary. It doesn't require being anti-science. But there's a bunch of design arguments because the world we live in is really surprising given naturalism and less surprising given theism. And that's why design arguments work and are interesting. And whether you're a scientist or philosopher or just interested, you should take them really seriously, I think.
Yeah, we should also mention, Zachary, and this is why I was confused of whether or not we had done any work on the channel, is that you've before I was even really into YouTube, I had a blog, and the blog and everything, the website's still around, capturingchristianity.com, so you guys can go visit it and everything. But you contributed some blog posts to that, and that's what I was thinking. I was like, we've done something together, and that was it. So
and there's some of this content in a much earlier form. Is some related stuff is there as well, so people can check it out if they want to see some written stuff. But also, Rope has a bunch of papers that people can find online for the details.
All right, Dr. Rope. So
and one thing that I would like to say is that I'm really excited to hear what kind of objections people think about for this. Like, I've been writing papers about this stuff and trying to find the objections from the literature and come up with objections of my own. And of course, like as I do this stuff, then my confidence has increased in this compatibility of design arguments and evolution. But I mean, it's there's been some philosophers and scientists who have argued on similar lines before, like Mats Wahlberg I've mentioned, and Stephen Evans has a brief mention of the compatibility, and Plantinga has his own way of arguing for this as well. So I'm just really looking forward to the possible philosophical and scientific objections that people bring, because they're gonna help develop the ideas better.
In other words, what you're saying is bring it. Bring. If you have an objection to the EDA,
right.
Bring it. Bring it in the live chat in the next video. Bring it in the comments of this video if you've got any objections to the argument, especially if you've made it this far. This is a 2.5 hour stream, which is a little bit longer than our typical stream, but it's been super. I mean, obviously, it's been super informative. We've covered a lot of ground, and there's still so much to talk about. But thank you guys both for joining me today. This has been awesome. I'm really looking forward to the next couple videos that we're planning to do together.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, let me just address the audience real quickly. If you guys have enjoyed this video, you'd like to support the channel, one of the ways you can do that is subscribing to the channel. That's an obviously free thing that you can do. Well, it's not exactly free. You still gotta like raise your thumb and press the button. So, I mean, you gotta spend some kind of energy. I suppose it's not completely free, but that's a way that you can support the channel. You can also support us financially if you're interested in doing that as well. We are completely financially support. The way that we get our money, the way that we operate is through your donations. So if you'd like to support this ministry that way, and you can afford to do it, then patreon.com/capturing Christianity. Links are in the description of this video. Thank you so much if you're considering doing that. And thank you to everyone else who is already supporting the channel in that way. But until next time, until the next video, we will see you guys later. All right, peace.